Hello, everyone, and welcome to day 2 of the 2020 virtual SNF Conference. As I mentioned in my welcoming remarks yesterday, each year the SNF Conference brings together some of the world's best thinkers, leaders, artists, iconoclasts, and visionaries to explore critical questions regarding the future of humanity and society. Yesterday, we had two extraordinary panels examining at first critical issues that had been discussed at past conferences, and secondly, reframing a number of complex questions on public health and public institutions, the future of work, the concept of a social contract, and of a sustainable future within the COVID-19 transformative framework. Today, we will be exploring humanity's relationship with one of the most important technologies of the 21st century, artificial intelligence. Breakthroughs in AI will touch every part of the human experience, from how we work, play, move, create, and live. So, we've brought a diverse group of AI experts and thinkers to explore what's in store for us. Today's sessions are a sneak preview of our 2021 conference, which will explore similar questions. Our first session, titled Humanity and AI, Cooperation, Collision, or Coevolution, will explore the promise of AI and the many surprising ways it is shaping the future of society, the way we work and connect, and our very idea of who we are. The moderator of this session is Andrew Zolli, Vice President of Planet Incorporation, forecaster and author. So, Andrew, over to you.
Thank you, Anna Cynthia. It's so great to be here with all of you today. Thank you to the SNF Foundation for convening us today. Thank you to all of you for showing up, and thank you especially to our three guests today, who it's my great pleasure and honor to help moderate and facilitate in conversation. Today, as Anna Cynthia mentioned, is a kind of a preview, a précis of a conference that we had hoped to be having in the SNFCC, in the Cultural Center in Athens, and which we hope to convene next year under healthier circumstances for all. So, but we felt it was important to continue the tradition of the work that we do and the work that the foundation does in convening these essential dialogues on questions that shape the future of the human experience. You couldn't ask for three more appropriate contributors to a discussion on the relationship between humanity and artificial intelligence than our three guests. And I do want to say to you just two things for everyone watching and participating. The first one is that this will be a discussion not just between the four of us, but we hope with you as well. As you can see on the screen, there is a mechanism. If you go to www.snf.org/questions with a capital Q, it'll take you to a page where you'll see a big question mark. If you click on that question mark, you can actually submit a question, and those questions will be edited and actually presented on the screen. We'll see if we can get to as many of them as we can. I also want to just mention that our purpose today is not just a generic discussion about artificial intelligence. There are many excellent, world-renowned conversations about the technology itself. Our conversation today is about humanity and AI. And so with that in mind, let me offer a few remarks to set up our discussion and then introduce our speakers, our conversationalists, and then start the conversation. There is no word in English to describe the mix of fascination, yearning, and anxiety that mark contemporary discussions of artificial intelligence. Every position is taken. Entrepreneurs wax breathlessly about its promise. Economists wonder about its potential for economic and labor dislocation. Policymakers wonder about constraining its potential for abuse. Circumspect engineers will tell you that it's much harder to do in practice than breathless headlines suggest. Activists point out AI's ability to perniciously lock in our unconscious and, frankly, sometimes not so unconscious biases. Other activists are busy using AI to overcome those very same biases. Techno-utopians look forward to an inevitable ecstatic merger of humanity and machine, while their more cynical contemporaries worry about existential risks and the loss of human control. In some sense, the diversity of all of this thinking and all of these perspectives is apt because all of these positions are well-founded, at least to some degree. AI will increase wealth, and it will concentrate wealth, and it will destroy wealth all at the same time. It will amplify our biases and be used to overcome them. It will support both democracy and autocracy. It will be a companion and a means of liberation from and a means of subjugation to various forms of labor. It will be used to help heal the planet and intensify our consumption of its resources. It will enhance life and diminish it. It will be deployed as an instrument of peace and an instrument of war. It will be used to tell you the truth and to lie to you. As the folk singer Andy DeFranco once said, every tool is a weapon if you hold it right. One thing we can say for certain, AI will not enter the scene neutrally because the world is not a neutral place. Its emergence will be conditioned as much by our social and cultural values, our economic systems, and our capacity for collective imagination as it will be by the technology itself. Is work drudgery or dignity? What should we not do with AI, even if we can? Whose opinions on those questions actually matter? And what do we owe each other anyway? How we answer these kinds of questions, indeed whether we ask them at all, hint at the tasks that we might assign to artificial intelligence and the considerations that will guide and constrain its emergence. Indeed, it's the urgent need to ask those questions that led us here today and led us to this conversation with these three remarkable people. So I'm very excited to introduce them to you. First, on the left of your screen is Azeem Azhar, the writer behind Exponential View, a absolutely must-read, and I will tell you as a subscriber, a must-read newsletter which explores how society and the political economy are changing under the force of technology. Azeem is also on the board of the Ada Lovelace Foundation, a leading independent research institute focused on ethics and AI. On the right-hand side of our screen is Madeleine Clare Elish, who's an anthropologist who leads the AI on the Ground initiative at the Data and Society Research Institute, where she and her teams investigate the promises and risks of integrating AI technologies into society. Through human-centered and ethnographic research, AI on the Ground sheds light on the consequences of deploying AI systems beyond the research lab in the real world, examining who benefits, who's harmed, and who is accountable. And finally, in the center of our screen is Blaise Arcas, who is a distinguished scientist at Google and a polymathic software engineer, software architect, and designer. He's a genuine authority on computer vision, machine intelligence, and one of the most significant figures in the field of AI today. It's my great pleasure to welcome all of you to this conversation, and I think we'll begin with Azeem. Azeem, we've been talking about the social and the technical and the socio-technical system and how they shape the human experience. Would you kick us off?
Of course, thank you very much, Andrew. What an honor to be invited to this fantastic conference and with panelists like Blaise and Madeleine. I do wish we could all have been in Athens for this, so hopefully we'll get an opportunity to do that. You know, I come at this question as somebody who was a practitioner, as a founder of a technology company that used some of these techniques, but heritage as a social scientist. And one of the things that has struck me as I've got to understand some of these technologies over the past decade or so is the confused narrative that surrounds both artificial intelligence and our understanding of what technology is in general. And I want to try to tackle both of those questions in 4 or 5 minutes, really, which is a brave undertaking. Let's start with briefly thinking about artificial intelligence. That is, in some sense, machines that imbue some of our notions of intelligence. They have a long history in our narratives. I mean, we're at the Summer Nostros Festival. The first example of autonomous vehicles were probably from Homer's Odyssey, with the Phaeacian ships that required no steersman, no gubernator, no oarsman, but just took the passenger where they wanted to go in comparative safety. And since that time, we have come up over the last 3,000 years with more and more stories about how we can animate with intelligence the machines that we create. But it constructs something of a confused narrative. When the term artificial intelligence was first used in a grant application in the United States in 1955 for a workshop that happened a year later, the key goal there was to, in some sense, replicate the process of the brain. So we sort of merged the idea of intelligent machines with intelligence being connected to the structures inside our own heads. And it does become quite confusing. And then I start to think about how do we explain this in a simple way? I mean, in a sense, there is some broad agreement that intelligence is the ability to act rationally to help some kind of entity achieve its objective. And one of my favorite stories about this comes from just after the French Revolution, when a mathematician called Gaspard de Prony was set the very difficult task of having to calculate and map all of the land in France in order to create a good taxation basis. And it was a difficult problem that was going to involve a lot of trigonometry, and it was quite hard maths for which there weren't sufficient trained mathematicians. So de Prony built what we would call today an AI system. He went off and he broke the task down into a lot of very simple subtasks, which is rather similar to what some of Blaise's computer vision systems do. They take the hard task of vision and break them down into simple mathematical tasks of multiplying matrices. In de Prony's case, it was addition and subtraction. And he thought, where can I find simple computers to undertake this calculation? I mentioned it was post-revolutionary France. There was an unemployment problem, specifically amongst the hairdressers to the aristocracy. The aristocracy were famous for their grand bouffant, the kind of which many of us have been sporting because of COVID lockdowns. And as the revolution went underway, the aristocracy either lost their heads and therefore their need for a bouffant, or they decided they weren't going to advertise their noble status with their haircuts, which put lots of hairdressers out of work. And so de Prony enlisted these hairdressers to do these simple mathematical additions and subtractions in groups of 60 layers of these neurons, and they added up to be able to do this much more complex mathematics. And it is a very simple way of explaining some of the key technologies we used in what's called artificial intelligence today. It is an entity that is able to act to achieve its objective, even if the sort of subunits are not that kind of capable. And the reason I bring that up is because for me, in a sense, it demystifies a lot of the language that is used around AI. Now, AI is embedded in this wider context of technology, and technology has, as we think of it, information technology today has suddenly accosted us. It didn't really matter 15 or 20 years ago what Apple chose to do or didn't do, or Microsoft chose to do or didn't do, because they weren't part of our everyday. And suddenly they have become part of our everyday. Now, roughly the origins of this industry is only 50 years or so old. The Intel 4004 microprocessor was released the year before I was born in 1971. But the timing of that is really interesting, as is its geographical location. So the Intel 4004 processor and the technology industry that was built around it was built in California, which was home at the time to a lot of people who were, in a sense, renegades towards authority. I mean, there was a lot of the sort of the LSD movement, Tim O'Leary, and so on. People who didn't have that sense of respect for the problems of authority. But it coincided with a change in the political economy that happened in the 1970s, which was the move towards deregulation, the move towards saying the government should not intervene in any kind of market. And the United States and the UK and many other countries with Reagan and Thatcher went through 20 or 30 years of taking their hands off the oars, off the brakes, at the time at which we had the technologies of the microchip accelerating. These non-interventionist political beliefs coincided with non-interventionist economic beliefs. And the consequence is that we ended up with these technology companies that are very powerful, with this very powerful tool of AI, that have traditionally said, don't argue with us, We are neutral. We know what's best. They're saying this in the context of a politics that says innovation is what matters. So we haven't been able to inspect the inner workings of these firms. And to keep us quiet, they've delivered us wonderful services like Netflix and iPhones that come through the post. And the truth is, humanity has had a coexistence with technology for the longest period of time. It's these technologies that have allowed us to change our cultural values, our social values, our family relationships. It's even gone further than that. I mean, the intestines of the human have a very different form factor to the intestines of our hominid ancestors, because over a couple of millions of years of evolution, as we have used tools to chop up our food, we have outsourced our digestion to those tools. And so we have a very different gut length to chimpanzees and gorillas who have to do all of this in their own bodies. And so ultimately we get to this strange situation where technology co-evolves with us, it's innate to us and to our condition. But over the last 40 or 50s, for reasons of economic and political power, we have been, as ordinary people, as the demos, abstracted away from that conversation and that discussion. It's very important for us to have that today because AI is a very powerful technology, I think at least as meaningful as the arrival of the printing press in Mainz in the 1440s. And that's why we need to have dialogues like this.
I really appreciate that, Azeem. It seems to me a kind of a fascinating, it's a fascinating thing that right now we live at a time when the realm of the techne, the makers of these tools, have become extraordinarily powerful institutions, in part because the technologies themselves are extraordinarily powerful and they radiate through the fibers of our social lives in all the ways that you describe, and our work lives in the ways that you described. And the polis, that is to say, the realm outside, the demos that you described, that space is weaker in relationship in terms of being able to determine what gets built and for whom and under what terms. But it seems to me that in all of that is really also the market and the philosophy of markets. You know, I'm struck by the fact that 8 of the 10 wealthiest people in America, who are among the very wealthiest people in the world, who own half of the wealth of the United States, all have stakes in artificial intelligence in one way or another in a significant way. And that raises questions for everyone else and for the practical ways in which we experience these technologies. So let me turn now to Madeleine. Madeleine, you're an anthropologist. You've been looking at the real world experiences. And I'm reminded of a story that happens. I'm speaking to you from Minneapolis, St. Paul, and literally outside my window is the back alley where once every Monday, the garbage truck comes along. And there were 3 people on the garbage truck for the longest time, for the whole time that I was here. And then recently the garbage truck got an upgrade. And it went from 3 people to 2 people, and then 2 people to 1 person, because there was a claw on the side of the truck that reaches out and grabs the garbage can. No one gets off the truck anymore and dumps it into the garbage truck. And I was discussing this with my garbage man, with the person who was involved, and I said, "How do you see your job?" And he said, "My job is to train the claw." And he saw himself as in the twilight. He said, "It's a good thing I'm in the twilight of my career because I don't know that I could pivot away from this." With all of those kinds of questions, Madeleine, how is the world of work changing? What are you seeing in the ways in which humanity is working differently or will work differently with these tools?
Well, I have a short presentation that I have a couple of stories to add to the story of your garbage man that maybe we can use as fodder for our conversation going forward. Please. So today I, as I sort of already started, want to talk to you about the relationship between humans and AI, and how I see that relationship going right and how I see that relationship going wrong and how we can think about that in the future. I want to do that by telling you about 3 stories that highlight people and processes that most stories about tech innovation render invisible. So story 1, bananas at self-checkout. a couple of years, I was at a typical grocery store in New York, and I went to, check out, used the self-checkout machine. I scanned each of my items. I got to a bunch of bananas, and I was amazed that the machine seemed to recognize that I had bananas, and the price just automatically popped up. I paused. I was really, really impressed at the quote-unquote smartness of the machine. Then I continued on checking out my items, and of course something went wrong. It always does, and so an attendant had to come over. And when she came over, I mentioned in passing that I was really impressed with how smart it was. I couldn't believe that it had just sensed that I had bananas. And the attendant looked at me and laughed, and she said, "Oh, it didn't know. I put in the code. I was standing over there gesturing, and I, put in the code so you didn't have to. It's much faster that way." Okay, so to be clear, I study this for a living. I study all of the kinds of invisible work that go into making technologies function, and I had misattributed intelligence to this self-checkout machine, and I hadn't even noticed the person who was actually making the whole process run smoothly. So why does this matter? Why am I starting with this story, you might say? Well, when we overestimate machines and we let the humans who actually enable those machines to work remain invisible, those people can be undervalued. They can be underpaid, and they're often taken advantage of. It means we end up valorizing technology at the expense of the human, in fact, who is often right there attending it. Across the AI pipeline and product lifecycle, there are humans guiding, maintaining, repairing, and enabling AI systems to be, intelligent. Scholars Mary Gray and Siddhartha Suri have termed this kind of work ghost work in the context of platform technologies. But Madeleine, you might be saying to yourself, AI will eventually be good enough to just make the human obsolete. But I think of that as the myth of the last mile, of this myth of eventual technological perfection, and I think this myth is dangerous because the history of technology tells us that this dream of technological perfection never comes true, that there are always dreams of replacing work and drudgery with advanced technologies, and it never pans out. Story 2. On the night of March 18, 2018, Alain Hertzberg was killed after being struck by a self-driving car in Tempe, Arizona. Hertzberg was crossing the street with her bike when the vehicle, which was operating in its autonomous mode, failed to accurately classify her moving body as an object to be avoided. Rafaela Vasquez, a backup safety driver whose task was monitoring the self-driving car, did not see Hertzberg crossing the street. Following the accident and Hertzberg's death, Uber resumed testing its vehicles, and it was cleared of all criminal wrongdoing. In contrast, the safety driver of the purported autonomous vehicle continues to this day to face the prospect of vehicular manslaughter charges. Is this right? Is this fair? That neither Uber, the actor who developed and deployed the technology, nor the state of Arizona, which allowed the testing to be conducted in the first place, are being held accountable? I'd argue no. But unfortunately, I wasn't surprised at how the story around accountability played out here. I wasn't surprised when blame shifted away from Uber and onto the safety driver. Rafaela, the safety driver in this case, had become a moral crumple zone. A moral crumple zone is a concept that my colleagues and I developed in a paper to call attention to a particular dynamic around the ways in which control and responsibility are often misaligned in automated systems. So just as the crumple zone in a car is designed to absorb the force of impact in a crash, the human in a highly complex and automated system may simply become a component, accidentally likely, but still a component that bears the brunt of the moral and legal responsibilities when the overall system malfunctions. What this means is that the technological component remains faultless and unproblematic, while the human operator is isolated as the weak link. We've published extensively on this, building on the history of automation, and there's obviously a lot more to say about control, agency, and responsibility in human-machine dynamics and human-machine teaming. What I'd like you to take away from this story and the concept of the moral crumple zone generally is that humans remain integral to the functioning of so-termed autonomous systems. And yet they are at the same time often disempowered and vulnerable to being held accountable for system-wide failures. The story of Alain Hertzberg's death, the criminal charges facing the safety driver, and Uber's ongoing testing and development is, for me, a cautionary tale. It's what happens when we establish a corrosive relationship between humans and AI, favoring innovation that focuses on autonomous technology at the expense of the humans who are working and walking alongside it. Story 3. If the previous story is what happens when we get the relationship between humans and AI wrong, this last story is, I'd argue, what happens when we get it right. For the last year, a system called Sepsis Watch has been implemented at the Duke University Hospital in Durham, North Carolina. The system was created to improve patient care by predicting which patients are most likely to develop sepsis, which is a deadly infection of the blood. Sepsis Watch is real AI in action. I was an anthropologist who was working with this team as they were developing it. And the creators of the system didn't design the system to replace doctors. They focused on the fact that without specialized nurses, whose job it would be to communicate the risk score produced by the AI, without these nurses to integrate the new technology into existing practices, the system would fail to work. So Sepsis Watch has ultimately improved patient care, and it has done this by elevating the human role in this success. The role of the nurses hasn't been hidden or downplayed or pushed to the side, but rather they have been centered and they have been acknowledged and respected as integral to the system. The story of the nurses in the emergency department working with Sepsis Watch represents one possible path. The story shows us what can happen when we stop focusing on making AI systems ever more autonomous or making AI the answer, and instead focus on recentering the human roles in a socio-technical system and highlighting the relationships and skills and capabilities that AI creates for and alongside its human users. So I'd argue that to recover and recenter the range of humans behind AI must be a foundation for responsible innovation going forward. Making the people and the processes visible is a primary way that we can collectively move toward a better future. And as the COVID-19 pandemic transforms our world, the people who make up the hidden human infrastructures that, in fact, we are now seeing allow our world to function, these hidden human infrastructures have been revealed as both essential and yet also structurally vulnerable and precarious. And in fact, it's imperative that so-termed essential workers, as Shudafa Gidla has written, do not become a euphemism for sacrificial workers. How we think about and design AI systems is linked to this moral imperative. The humans are there. The question is, how will we acknowledge, support, and empower them going forward? Making the people and processes visible and recentering the values of humans who work alongside AI systems is one step in the right direction. Thank you.
Thank you, Madeleine. My head is buzzing with questions, and I'm reminded, before we turn to Blaise, I'm reminded of one of the most durable pieces of writing about the relationship between human beings and complex technological systems that I've read, which was by a wonderful thinker named Rich Gold, who was the artist in residence at Xerox PARC many years ago. And he wrote this defining, wonderful it takes about an hour to read, a piece called "How Smart Does Your Bed Have to Be Before You're Afraid to Go to Sleep at Night?" And all it does, I would encourage everyone to read it. It's a spectacular piece of writing because it doesn't include a single declarative sentence. It's just a list of questions. And it asks, in addition to this question of human beings in moral crumple zones and the way in which we concentrate liability among people who are ghost workers, right? Or otherwise involved in the system. There's also this other piece of this story, which is about the cognitive burden of the complexity and illegibility of the world. My challenge is one of the most things we could all relate to in your story about the bananas is that the self-checkout system always goes wrong. So if it always goes wrong, why are there people there in the first place? Why are we using them at all? And part of the reason is that human beings are embedded in a system that sees those very human beings as costs to be eliminated, and as burdens rather than as at the center of the equation. This is a theme I'd like us to return to later in the conversation. I'd like to now turn to Blaise. Blaise, you are at the forefront of artificial intelligence and machine learning. You do a great deal of work on mobile devices, but I know that you think very widely and broadly about the future of AI. So and I know that you're involved in many aspects of this work at Google. Why don't you tell us a little bit about your work and what you're thinking about these days?
Sure. So wonderful comments from Madeleine and Azeem, both. Which I would agree with 100%. And I think quite a lot about the socio-technical systems that the products that we build get embedded into, and how those systems inform what we build and how what we build in turn goes back and changes those systems, and the feedback loops that sometimes virtuously, sometimes viciously ensue from that. I have some slides. I'm going to try and maybe whip through a few of them, but in the interest of trying to keep a few minutes for us to actually discuss, maybe keep it really short. Can you pull up the deck?
Before you go to the slides, Blaise, let me just say that because of the technical disruption, we're going to add 10 minutes to the end of the session. So we have enough time to actually have some conversation to take some questions. So please proceed.
I should let my team know that I'll be 10 minutes late to the meeting. But okay, yes, let's go. So that's me. These are some of the kinds of things that I work on with my team. So a lot of AI or machine learning features in Pixel and Android smartphones that Google ships. We make them, including things including features that use AI technologies that are quite controversial nowadays, like face recognition. So face unlocking of Pixel phones is enabled by face recognition engine that we make. And face recognition is a great example of a technology that, if used for ill, creates surveillance and chilling effects and power imbalances and all kinds of really negative externalities. On the other hand, if you have face recognition in a phone to help with unlocking and for your phone to essentially understand when you are paying attention to it or directing your either sight line or your speech toward it versus somewhere else, and all of that is local to the device, there's no surveillance implication to that whatsoever. It's purely prosthetic. I'd say the same thing about a face recognition engine, for example, that you might put on a pair of glasses and that whispers in your ear the name of the person you're talking to out of a contact list that you explicitly memorize. And if all of that is happening locally, then what you have is something like a hearing aid that's replacing a faculty that that most of us have in our singular gyrus of being able to recognize faces, as opposed to surveillance technology. On the other hand, you take exactly the same neural net and put it in a system like London's cameras that pepper the streets, and now you have something really dark. So it's not really the neural net so much as it is the whole socio-technical system that it's embedded in and what happens as a result. Next slide, please. We do a lot of making of devices for embedding in the environment too, like these Coral boards, which are a little bit like Raspberry Pis with neural net accelerators in them. Those can be used for all sorts of industrial applications, and for doing various tasks that intelligence could be useful for, like the banana task, but in ways that don't involve surveillance. And I'll explain what I mean. Yes.
You're speaking to me. Please continue.
Okay. Sorry. So these devices can do things like object detection and pose estimation, image segmentation, key phrase detection. What is that good for? Well, if you imagine that that what it is seeing, what a device like this is able to see, is a count of number of people in an environment, then the only information that needs to go off a device like that for a lot of different kinds of applications is number of people visible. That's what you would want if you have a device that's looking at the length of a line in an airport, or the occupancy of a room, for COVID purposes, in order to ensure that occupancy is below a certain number. And you want the intelligence to be embedded in the device to be able to do that people count, because what you don't want is for the video of everything that the camera saw to be uploaded to some server, where it then turns into a possible source of surveillance. So, this is a case where embedding intelligence in the devices is actually critical in order for them to be able to be used for a socially beneficial purpose that doesn't carry along with it the potential for abuse. We, in addition to thinking about doing the running of neural nets on devices, as I've just illustrated, we've also done a lot of thinking about how it is that AI or ML systems can learn in a decentralized way. Federated learning is one of the techniques that we've invented for doing that. There's a comic book online that describes how it works, but basically it takes the training process and decentralizes that as well, in such a way that that if there's an error signal or a correction signal that can be measured on those devices, they all kind of learn collaboratively without the actual data, without the observations ever being sent to a server or opening up the environments that those devices are operating into surveillance in any way. The comic book goes into more detail about how all of this works in ways that are both technically rigorous and that are entertaining. I'm quite proud of the information design here. So what I wanted the message that I really wanted to give here is that I think that we tend to associate companies at the moment with AIs. If the AI is Alexa, then it equals Amazon. If it's Cortana, then it equals Microsoft. OK Google is explicitly identifying Google as a company with a digital assistant. Of course, assistants are only one form of AI. Something that recognizes bananas is a much simpler form. But what I really want to point out is that this kind of monotheistic approach to thinking about AI in a very centralized way, as an avatar of a corporation, and everything being a service, is actually really problematic, and it's something that we need to move away from. I call this idea the Secret Commonwealth after this book by Robert Kirk from 1691, which is so he was Robert Kirk was an ethnographer of fairy. So this book is sort of half occultism, half ethnography about what society, including elves, fauns, fairies, and all sorts of other entities, is like. It's unclear reading Robert Kirk whether he actually believes in the things he's writing about or not. Those of you who are Philip Pullman fans might recognize that the Secret Commonwealth is also the name of Volume 2 of the Book of Dust. Philip Pullman is the author of his Dark Materials, wonderful fantasy trilogy. This is sort of the second trilogy in that series. So this Secret Commonwealth is the kind of world of fairies and fauns and other sorts of things that is sort of occult and not necessarily in view of the humans who interpenetrate with that world. This is Philip Pullman. His demon, which he believes is this species of bird, is a metaphor for the sort of extended self that I find very powerful. Any of you who have seen the series or the movie, which wasn't very good, or better read the books, know that the world that Philip Pullman imagines is one in which we all have a sort of familiar, almost like a witch's familiar, that extends ourself with additional capabilities. That augmentation idea, I think, is a very powerful one for how AI in personal devices ought to work in a way that is purely empowering as opposed to disempowering. But of course, the world of fairy goes beyond these personal demons or personal companions, and it also extends into the environment. Sorry, next slide, please. So if you have a device in the environment that's recognizing bananas or counting people in a room, that's also a kind of fairy world creature. And the idea that all of those fairy world creatures should be faces of a company, I see as being a little bit like the Abrahamic monotheistic tradition, the sort of spooky centralization, which happened in the Jewish and Christian and Muslim worlds, for the last few thousand years, has increasingly dominated world religions, and has happened in the tech industry. Really in the time since Google, when we've begun to think about servers and data centers as being the center of everything. For me, this jingle about Santa Claus really sums it up. He sees you when you're sleeping. He knows when you're awake. He knows if you've been bad or good, so be good for goodness sake. Santa is kind of a God light, I suppose, for children to practice their faith skills, and I find this message truly chilling. Next. So if we want our technology to be ambiently involved in our intimate lives, in our homes, on or eventually in our persons, embedded in our commons and public spaces, and we want to avoid mass surveillance, we want to avoid a total concentration of power and information, we want normal social relations with our technology, and we want reliability and robustness and responsiveness and security, then we have to go back to a pre-Christian sort of tradition in which there really is a fairy world that involves many entities, not just a few singular ones with sort of octopus-like tentacles that reach into everywhere. So, if there's a jinn in the car that is giving you driving directions, it needs to be aware of what's going on inside the car, of who is speaking, who is talking to who, what's happening with the turnoff, and so on. But if that means that a company is watching everybody and listening to everybody in the car, that's really bad, right? You want that AI to be located and embodied in the car under your own control and trustworthy, and not leak anything about what's happening inside the car to any other entity. Next. If you have a door guardian, which is doing something maybe as simple as opening or closing the door right when there's a person there, and maybe not when there's a dog there or something, then that's a very simple function. Again, you don't want that to be to mean that there's video going from that door to some central entity. City spirits that do things like monitor for density of crowds in COVID times, or that regulate various kind of urban functions, city functions, in response to human presence. You want those things to work in the same way. Eventually, we'll have smart dust. We'll have things that are very small and that control very small aspects of the environment or regulate very small aspects of the environment. You don't want all of those to be the endpoints of something central. So I just want to close with this by acknowledging that an AI or a spirit or an object of the kind we've just been talking about, it always serves the interests of something. And so, thinking about AIs as some kind of abstract entity that just sort of falls from the sky, it's never correct. It's always political. It's always in a relationship of furthering the interests of something or being in tension with other things. And those somethings span a very, very wide range of scales, from human individuals to companies, institutions, political parties, cities, all the way up to the planet. And understanding those social relationships, what kinds of harms can come to them, whose interests those things are serving, and so on. Understanding that when we have many AIs, they fit into the same matrix of relations is something that we have to really come to grips with, I think, at a very deep level. And I'll end there.
Thank you so much, Blaise. Together, I want to thank the three of you for just three terrific sets of overlapping insights. And I'd like to ask you a couple of questions and encourage everyone who's watching, please do submit questions at snf.org/Q questions. Click on the question mark and submit. We'd love to hear from you as well. Given the extraordinary coercive power of markets and the fact that we live increasingly in a market, not only do we interact with markets, but we seem to live within a sort of market society more and more with inexorable inducements and coercive coercions to align ourselves with various capitalist instincts. I guess one question I have, and I want to start with you, Blaise, this world you describe, it operates in and it emerges in the context of and must align itself with that other system, that capitalist system, with all of its intense private interests. Do we need something like an AI Bill of Rights? Are there new rights that we need around the inspectability of the algorithms and tools that govern our lives? Do we need the ability to turn them off? There are precious few off buttons with many of these technologies in general, or some mechanism for challenging them. It's sometimes very difficult to challenge an algorithm that's literally burned into hardware. So I'd like to ask you that question, and then I'd like to go to Azeem and Madeleine as well.
We certainly need regulation. So regulation is a critical component of making these things not suck. Madeleine raised the issue of crumple zones, of moral crumple zones, which I think is an excellent metaphor, and one that comes about through, it's not just through minimizing the human, it's actually through minimizing the AI, right? And not acknowledging that it is an actor. There's somehow like a shell game in which we pretend that these AI entities don't exist, that they're not serving anybody's interests. We use the passive voice. We don't acknowledge that they are actors and they're acting in a very particular way and in a very particular interest. And it's only by acknowledging that we can start to talk about what kinds of alignments of interest make sense. But I also want to say that talking about regulation in a very abstract, in the way that I fear often the EU does, actually, of like, we need to be able to turn them off, et cetera. Like, who is this we exactly? What are the social relations that are being discussed? I feel like we're a little bit too limited when we think about either this sort of neoliberalist idea that everything is about capitalism and the push and pull of interests. And this sort of post-fall of the Soviet Union idea where everything is about the invisible hand is not how nature or humans work at all. We constantly regulate each other, ourselves, our institutions in all kinds of ways, and we need to sort of acknowledge that that's how nature works, it's how humans work, it's how institutions work, and think about these new AI entities as being part of that matrix in the same way that anything else is. When you try to make entities disappear, you privilege some of them in ways that I think we've seen with respect to all kinds of other intelligent entities like corporations. So I don't think AI is new in this respect. We just need to get off this kind of neoliberalist idea that somehow invisible hand is good enough.
Yeah, in many conversations with non-specialists about these issues, they describe a world where they are already enfranchised or disenfranchised in these systems, and this exacerbates, limits, enhances, changes those relations in some way, but they don't enter into a neutral space. Madeleine or Azeem, do you want to pick up on this theme of what we need in terms of regulations or a Bill of Rights or some sense of a new political economy around these ideas?
Why don't we hear from Madeleine first?
Oh, sure. Well, so I'll just jump in and excuse me. There's a dog, so if you hear a dog, sorry. Something that I think Blaise began to talk about. I mean, something that worries me about while the sort of urge for an AI Bill of Rights makes sense, there's also some kind of insidious logic around that sort of says everything with respect to AI is new and we must reinvent the world. And that is, right, that is a conceit of digital technologies generally, right? That like they can operate anywhere and do anything, and it erases context and specificity. And so, you know, I am more interested in trying to understand and recover from the past. I love this idea of reviving the old ways, but also to look at existing forms of regulation that AI could be integrated into. Because the other thing about an AI Bill of Rights sort of type of regulation also centers the people who are making AI as the most important sort of or knowledgeable actors, when in fact we've been regulating all kinds of technologies. And there are activists and civil society groups who also need to be included in the table. And so, again, focusing on the technology as the thing we need to focus on takes away from some of the other ways we might address the problem.
That's great. Azeem.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. One of the things that we have learned over the last several years, once we've been able to train some of these tools onto our existing data, is that it has uncovered empirically biases and prejudices that exist in our culture and our literature. One of my friends did some work a few years ago where she identified that the kind of adjectives that we used around names of different ethnic or gender background throughout Western literature, and you can imagine the kind of biases that showed up. Now, people in the humanities, feminist scholars have known about this for decades and decades. We had it now quantitatively across billions and billions of words. And I think what's interesting there is that we get into what philosophers call the is-ought problem, which is that AI techniques are actually forcing us back to, do we want to reflect the world as it is, which is a kind of conservative Burkean view, or do we want to change the world into what we ought to think it ought to be, which is a more progressive view? And that's not a question about AI or indeed any other technology. That is a question about the moral dimension and our ability to come together and have a dialogue or not have a dialogue, as our colleagues from the French Revolution in 1789 chose to do. I think one thing that we need to recognize, though, is that as we get these new technologies, they do create new notions of power and right. I mean, simply think about the idea of the monopoly. Monopolies were seen as good things by states. They granted monopolies to inventors. They granted monopolies to the East India Company and the Dutch East India Company and the Royal Africa Company to exploit the colonies and people. And then at the turn of the 20th century, they started to realize around the time of the oil companies that monopolies were not so good. And so we constructed a new set of laws based around some new techno-economic realities that emerged. So I agree with Blaise and Madeleine that we should not create sort of AI rights outside of the natural order of human rights. But I do think that, as with previous technologies, they create new possibilities. Things that were imaginaries become realities, and those then require new types of rights, new types of political conceptions.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting too, just in response to the three of you and your reflections here, because these tools are bound up in a small number of extraordinarily large organizations that are commercial and proprietary organizations. We tend to focus on naturally one's mind goes to kind of the governance frame there. Yet it's worth noting first that in addition to a lot of work is done by super empowered individuals. We have seen transformational moments that have occurred, and I think of Edward Snowden as a kind of perfect example of this, who's not an IBM or a Google or a Microsoft or a Facebook or what have you. He's just one well-placed individual, or frankly, Julian Assange, or a whole set of people that we could point to in those communities. So it's interesting that some of us will learn in this next generation to leverage these tools outside of institutional contexts. The other thing I wanted to mention to you, I wanted to share a brief personal story with you, and get you to react to it. And maybe we'll hold this as the close, because we have to. We're a little bit over on time, and we're going to have a fantastic conversation next, led by Arthi Krishnan, a fantastic group of AI researchers and ethicists from all different perspectives and different parts of the world. When my daughter, I have a daughter who's 10, and when she was about 18 months old and she was learning to crawl around the house, she learned how to use my mobile phone. So she learned how to turn on my phone with her finger and spin to an application, actually spin up something she liked to do, which was a little game, and beat me at it regularly because it was what she loved to do. And as she learned to crawl around the house, there was a fascinating moment when, for about 6 months, everything that was rectangular within reach had swipe marks on it, as she ran the experiment about what was responsive in the environment with her fingers, what would magically turn on and what wouldn't. And if you think about it, she had no prior information, and she knew that this one device or several devices did this, but they weren't even devices to her. They were just rectilinear shapes. To this day, when she's irritated with me, she gives me a swipe mark. Like, I've had it with you, Daddy. I'd like to move on to the other. I'd like to swipe to the other version of you. Right?
I love that.
So, yeah, and this is now hard-coded in her consciousness. And so what I'd like to ask you to do is to think for a moment, and I'll ask Madeleine if you'd like to go first on this. Let me just give you the sense of this. As these tools saturate our lived experience, how might they change us in the way that we think, in the way that we perceive ourselves, not just the way that we interact with the world? Well, let me just ask you, Madeleine, would you like to go first on that one, or yes?
Sure, because I will take a piece of that, and I will also address one of the questions that I saw that just came in, which is, I can't see into the future. I'm not sure how exactly AI will change us, or these, this suite of technologies we call AI. But I do think that what we must keep in mind is actually sort of where you were going earlier, which is individual human agency in the kind of progression of tech, right? That this is not a teleological tech is going to, we have some agency. We as humans, we as diverse types of humans. And so there was, a question about how might the panelists connect some of this work to the discussions around racial equity and the sort of rise in the imperative of anti-racism. And I would just sort of say that maybe instead of focusing on folks like Ed Snowden, who also worked actually for a very powerful organization, the U.S. government, right? We could think about all of the people who are in the streets, all of the activists right now who are organizing and collecting in real life to change the political discussions that we have. And so I think, people like us on this panel can, think about how we design what we should do in the future, but we should also be sure that we continue to respect and empower all of the other voices that aren't just focused on AI.
Thank you, Madeleine. How about you, Blaise?
So a couple of quick points. One, Madeleine, I completely agree. And one of the reasons that this movement is happening now in the way that it is because the phone has allowed police brutality to be exposed to people in positions of privilege in ways that I mean, black people in the U.S. have known for a long time that this is how they're treated. This is what happens. Many white people are only seeing it for the first time because of the cell phone and because of social networks and so on. The organization of those marches happens via those technological tools as well. I'm not trying to glorify the technological tools, which also have a lot to answer for on the other side of the coin, with respect to enablement of that very same police brutality and of surveillance and of social technical feedback loops that lead to over-policing and all kinds of other stuff. But it has changed the landscape in that pharmacon kind of way. That is both empowering and disempowering at the same time, as Andrew talked about earlier. One of the new things that when we talk about AI, I mean, it's always this very vague term, but neural nets are allowing us to do something in the last decade that has not been possible before, which is to extend natural user interface to a spot where machines can cover that gap between humans and technologies rather than humans having to cover that gap themselves. So being able to do speech recognition as opposed to having to learn how to type, being able to understand swipe or gaze or other kinds of things as opposed to having to use more archaic interfaces that need to be learned. That is really a big change. And it's a big change that is potentially very empowering of large numbers of humans, but also brings with it all kinds of possibilities for bias and negative social technical loops. But it is quite new. I mean, I think we sometimes lose sight of. I mean, we push back a lot against this. Like, yes, AI is just another word for old clothes. We've had these power relations and these issues for a long time. But that ability for understanding of human beings to be done by machines is fundamentally very new. It was completely out of reach 20 years ago.
Yeah. Thank you. I want to say, Madeleine, I completely agreed with your comments also. I'm cognizant of time, and let's give Azeem the last word here. Thank you.